We don't hear it. Usually we hear it. Working right? Can folks out there hear us? Can somebody say in the chat whether you can hear us? All right, then we're gonna get started. All right, well, welcome to SESE Colloquium for Wednesday, March 30th, 2022. And we're pleased to have our every semester spectacular SESE postdoctoral presentations. So we're gonna have two presentations here in just a minute. Before that, brief announcements. SESE Community Conversation is tomorrow at noon. You should have an email with a link, etc. Among other things, Professors Scannapieco and Young are going to talk about the SESE DEIJ strategic plan. So please come join the SESE Community Conversation tomorrow from noon to 1 on Zoom. Any other announcements that we should be making? All right. So with that, I am glad to turn this over to Professor Heather Throop to introduce our first speaker.
All right. Thanks, Ariel. It is an absolute pleasure to have the opportunity today to introduce our postdocs, our first of two postdoc speakers. So Dr. Luiza Aparecido. She is a SESE Exploration Postdoc Fellow. She's now in her second year of this postdoc fellowship. And so a little background on Luiza's work. She received her Bachelor's of Science in Forest Engineering in Brazil. And then she wanted to get a Master's of Science in Tropical Forest Science, also working in Brazil, doing fieldwork in the Amazon near Manaus, looking at sapwood area. She then moved to the US for her PhD that she did at Texas A&M University, where she continued to do tropical forest work. So she worked there on the ecophysiology of forest canopies under wet canopy conditions. And then she moved to ASU to do a postdoc. First, she was working on a postdoc in soils, where she was looking at transportation networks in leaf veins, and continuing work there in tropical forests, although she started to see the light a little bit there and started also doing some desert work and has some really cool papers. I'm a little biased here, but she was looking at desert plants and desert plant adaptations. So we sort of nudged her a little bit further that direction, convinced her that deserts would be really fun to apply some of her skills and really cool work to. So she applied for an exploration fellowship, where she's working with JD and Kevin Holtein at the Desert Botanical Garden, and me. And she's in this work, which she'll talk about some of that work today. She's looking at urban plants and so how selection of plants influences cooling capacity. And so all this time, during the SESE fellowship, she really has been an exemplary postdoc in that she's not been doing just the work that she'll talk about today. She also was recently awarded NSF grant proposal, and she's the sole ASU PI of that. That's work that none of her postdoc advisors here are involved with. She's been really successful in student mentoring, had a couple undergraduate thesis students, and she's recently had a whole slew of job interviews, which is really exciting. And I'm going to use some discretion here and not say more than that, but check in back with her in the near future. So thanks, Luiza, for sharing your research today.
Thank you so much, Heather. That was a great introduction. Can everybody hear me okay? Should be fine. Okay. All right. So thank you all for coming. And as Heather already introduced, I work with plant ecology, and I have been mentored by JD and Heather. And my work here today that I'm going to present to you is entitled Excessive Plant Water Loss Mitigates Thermal Stress. So I'm going to start really broad with climate change is here to stay pretty much, and we are facing this right on as humans. So we already been seeing really more frequent, more intense weather phenomena like hurricanes, wildfires, droughts, and floods. And it's been obviously an issue when it comes to our livelihoods. But one thing to consider as well is that these episodic events are also directly affecting how plants produce and grow and how they survive in these ecosystems. So some of the work that I have done so far included, when it comes to these stressors, included how plants respond to floods. This was after Hurricane Harvey in Texas, wildfires, leaf scorching, insect outbreaks, as well as how drought and wind can lead to mortality of trees. And so considering how many stresses and how much plants can be affected by climate change effects, you would expect that the vegetation would start pushing towards a threshold of mortality. So as conditions become from optimum going to drier, more drier, more and warmer and longer drought events, you would expect that there would be a shift in composition. So if plants can't survive, you're going to lead towards mortality, but you're also going to expect a shift from species that are more tolerant to these conditions to start occupying the areas that the other species were there before, which would change how you would have our ecosystems in general. With that, my work has been focused on this very overarching question, which is, can plants adapt to extreme conditions? A lot of my work has been to investigate the strategies that portrays how plants resist these conditions, how resilient they are, but also how plants can buffer these effects when it comes to climate, as well as human comfort when it comes to urban systems. So when you consider all these strategies, this will shape how ecosystems function, especially when you think about plant composition and climate. But like I commented, I've worked with the various types of plant stresses, but today I'm going to focus on thermal stress. One of the reasons for that is that with the change in climate globally, if CO2 continues increasing with time, we would be seeing that across the world, we would have a significant increase in number of heat waves. So currently we have heat waves being around 10 per summer on average across the world, and we would be shifting to a 72 days of heat waves per summer in the future, which is not only going to happen in the tropics, but you can also see that could be an issue here in the United States. And I don't need to remind how last year was we had one of the harshest heat waves ever recorded, especially in the Pacific Northwest, and it was the highest temperatures that Canada ever recorded. So when it comes to how plants respond to that, is something that is very, very important. But before I move on to my studies, I want to remind you, like, why do plants use water? So the first factor is water is important for the photosynthetic process. The reason for that is that when plants photosynthesize, when they capture the light and they capture the carbon from the atmosphere while also uptaking water, that combination of carbon dioxide and water will lead to the formation of sugar, and also with sugar, that is pretty much the focus of the result of the photosynthetic process. To also maintain that sugar will be led into growth of plants, you would need the water to maintain the hydration of these tissues. And third, water can be used to regulate leaf temperature through the process of transpiration, which I'm going to explain later on the next slide. So leaves, when leaves are photosynthesizing, they do it through pores called stomata, where you can see here on the bottom left corner. And with the stomata open, it will simulate carbon to be used at photosynthesis, but at the same time, they also lose water through those pores. However, when you were to consider that air and leaf temperature would be increasing, one of the tendencies is to see that CO2, sorry, that microphone lit a little glitch here. So with the increase of air and leaf temperature, the expectancy is that the plants would be more vulnerable to lethal and thermal damage, as well as decreasing their stomatal conductance. What I mean by stomatal conductance is the amount of water that's being transported from the stomata. What happens is that when plants are stressed, they shut their stomata as a way to protect their conductivity and their functioning in general. So with that, stomatal conductance would decrease because they would preserve their conductivity by closing their stomata, and with that, you would lead to having less photosynthesis occurring and less transpiration. This process is called the marginal gain strategy. And a better way to see this, here's a graph from Drake and collaborators with an experimental eucalyptus project in which photosynthesis on the top and transpiration on the bottom. You would see that as canopy temperatures increases, the control data shows that plants decline their photosynthesis and transpiration with increase of temperature. We should also highlight that the darker dots that are the model data also follows this trend, because that's what it's the expectance that If plants are stressed, they're going to shut their stomata, no photosynthesis, and less transpiration. However, when they subjected this to a heat wave experiment, we see the same trend for photosynthesis, that plants would have less photosynthesis as temperatures increases. However, even though the model still projected a decrease in transpiration for the heat wave plants, they did see that the observations for their study had an increase in transpiration and not a decline, which goes against what was expected, considering the behavior that was already known for plants. This behavior here we're calling the alternative water use strategy. And one of the questions that arises from this is, how many species adopt this strategy? And what are the implications of the local and global carbon and water balance? So with that, we wanted to find a place that would be really interesting to focus on this question. And why not the desert, in a place that leaf temperatures can exceed 120 Fahrenheit in a May day in 2018. So with that, our question here was, is alternative water use behavior prevalent in hot environments? And our hypothesis is that extreme vapor cooling would be common. But I want to highlight that the reason that I say extreme vapor cooling is that plants evaporative cool all the time. When they're transpiring, they are always going to be cooling down their leaves. However, by extreme, I mean that when the plants are stressed and they're still transpiring, but photosynthesis is not occurring, it's because the plants are pushing the boundary, continue transpiring to cool down their leaves. So you would expect that behavior would occur when leaf temperature is high. But the other reason that could happen is for species that have leaves with higher carbon costs, which means that the plants invest carbon so much on their leaves that if they lost it, it would be too hard to grow them back later. And it would also compromise their photosynthetic products in the near future. So we did this work at the Desert Botanical Garden in 2018 in pre-monsoon conditions. So this was very, very hot and very dry. We chose 11 Sonoran desert plant species, and these plants were well watered. I just want to highlight that. Myself and my awesome SOL students collected gas exchange data and leaf temperature data throughout the day for these 33 plants. So what we found, is that here you see photosynthesis on the y-axis, and you find transpiration on the x-axis. And then you see here that the orange line that shows the marginal gain species does behave how we expected, that when net photosynthesis increases, transpiration also increases. However, a subset of species, in this case, 36% of the species that we worked with, showed the completely different behavior, in which photosynthesis did not increase, but transpiration continued increase, which was not what we would expect otherwise, compared to what we expect for marginal gain strategies. A different view of this is seeing this the per species graph. And here you have the species that were considered alternative water users highlighted here with the arrows. And as you can see, or the plants had much lower photosynthesis as it increased transpiration, or transpiration increased exponentially while also not increasing photosynthesis as much as other species. A different way of seeing this is this diurnal graph for photosynthesis. So you see here the marginal gain species on the left graph, and then the alternative water use species on the right graph. And you see here that both groups declines photosynthesis when the day became warmer. However, when you look at transpiration, you see that the marginal gain species also decline its transpiration rates. However, the alternative water users increased or kept their transpiration constant when the day became much warmer, showing as an evidence that they are performing evaporative cooling to cool down their leaves during the most stressful part of the day. And what we found is that the species that were doing this were plants that did have more costly leaves. Again, if they have a lot of carbon invested in those leaves, it actually is more important to lose the water than actually lose the leaf, which is very interesting, showing how plants adapt to these conditions in a harsh environment like the desert. And here you can also see that the species that were alternative water users, here in blue, occur in areas that are not as resource rich. So considering that these plants occur in canyons and mountains that doesn't have as much resources, it would be harder to sprout new leaves and continue photosynthesizing if the leaves were damaged by heat. So you might be wondering, or at least if you're not, I get this question a lot, is how prevalent is this strategy across biomes? So the question right now is, we don't know, but we got this NSF award that Heather commented earlier, and we're going to be starting this campaign starting this year for the next 4 years to investigate how these plants change across biomes, and very glad to be continue collaborating with the Desert Botanical Garden as well as some collaborators at UC Berkeley. But in summary, what we found is that plants do perform evaporative cooling, even if it does compromise how much carbon is being assimilated. And that we find that these drivers are related to how costly the leaves are, even though we were surprised that this occurred in more water limited habitats. So we hope that with this grant, we can start kind of teasing out if we had more drier soils and the plants weren't as well watered, that we wouldn't have, that plants might behave differently. So we'll see what we find. But that photosynthesis is not always proportional to transpiration, and further development is needed for current model regulation models. So now focusing on the preliminary findings for my SESE fellowship here, which is a complete turnaround. It's still with plant physiology, but focusing on urban plant systems. So for just a recap, like what is urban heat islands? You probably heard that Phoenix is, well, you don't even need to hear it. You know that Phoenix is hot. Phoenix is very hot, and it isn't just a problem here. The urban heat effects are a problem in many capitals, in many cities in the United States and in the world. And what it consists of is that highly paved areas with big structures made out of concrete will absorb heat and create this pretty much a heat bubble, and it will increase surface and air temperatures. As you start having more vegetation in more open areas and more open soils that can evaporate you'll have cooler areas. One of the major points to mitigate this issue is to plant trees. And trees are just fantastic beings because trees can do so much. And I could go on and on about all the other effects, all the other benefits of trees in urban systems. But today I'm going to focus on evapotranspiration and shade cooling. So most of the work done when it comes to the benefits of trees to microclimate has been focused on shade and how that cools down the overall environment. But we also need to recognize that plants also transpire and cool down their surroundings. But we also need to remember that if you were to think about a plant that really does cool the environment efficiently, we also would require having a tree that doesn't cost as much. That cooling isn't as costly. So finding a tree that doesn't use as much water, but is still efficient in cooling through their shade, as well as their transpiration rates, is very important. Which leads to our current work that we've been calling cost of shade. And the ultimate goal is to develop a metric that evaluates the cooling benefit of individual trees relative to their maintenance costs in urban landscapes. But I want to highlight, when I say maintenance, it doesn't include pruning or any of the other maintenance costs that trees might have. And here we're pretty much focusing on how much would it cost to cool down an area. So the Celsius per dollar that a tree can have. So to really hone in on these parameters, we had to separate our project in three different sub-projects. And today I'm going to present the preliminary findings of the first one, which is what is the species-specific cooling effect of trees native and exotic commonly found in Phoenix, Arizona. And specifically, how plant water use and shade projection differed across species, and how these parameters change from spring to midsummer when temperatures regularly exceeded 40 Celsius. This work was also conducted at the Botanical Garden, but in an area separated from the main trails. And we did collect data from April of last year till end of July last year as well. And we selected 14 species, 8 native and 6 exotic. One exotic actually died, so that says something about it, I guess. And these are big potted plants. Here we also have my students that were helping me out at that time, and we collected a myriad of measurements. We measured diurnal leaf gas exchange, climate and microclimate, canopy temperature, leaf traits, normalized difference vegetation index, which is how it's a proxy for how healthy the plants or how stressed they were, canopy structure, as well as the shade. But due to time and also because we're still processing data, I'm going to only present our results for leaf gas exchange and climate. So here, the first thing that we found with our data is that exotic tree species did not significantly transpire more than native species, which was very interesting because this is something that comes up a lot in conversations here in Arizona about should we just all take exotics out and just put natives? But realistically, when you think about it, in black or the exotic plants, the some native species transpire or use as much water as exotic plants do. So there are things that we need to think about when it comes to choosing these plants, especially when it comes to their water use. And before I move on, I want to highlight how did the climate change across seasons. So here you have April, May, June, and July, air temperature and leaf temperature on the left y-axis and evaporative demand on the right y-axis. And as you can see, there is an increase of temperature that increases till June and stays pretty much constant June and July. But considering that we had a pretty good monsoon in July, it was kind of surprising that temperatures didn't decrease much more than that. But we do see the evaporative demand did decrease because it was more humid. But keep in mind that it was still pretty hot. Another thing to consider is that in June, we had that heat wave that before it went to the Pacific Northwest was here in Phoenix the week before we did our measurements. So we were pretty lucky to capture these effects on our data as well. And here you have it. So here's transpiration on the left and stomatoconductance on the right. And you can see the transpiration follows the trend quite well, that as temperature is increased, it also increased transpiration. And we see similar trends with stomatoconductance, although there was a little bit of difference in April. But what I want to really highlight here is that both these parameters in June, right after the heat wave, shows that all the species increased their transpiration stomatoconductance exponentially, which goes against, again, if plants were as stressed, they would shut their stomata and not lose that precious water. But it does come at a cost, because as you can see, July did not have as much of a high transpiration stomatoconductance that could have been due to thermal damage caused by the heat waves. For a better look on that, here are 3 species that we worked with that had very different behaviors with across months. So for live oak, you see that there was an exponential increase with transpiration as the months went by. And it kept pretty high even in July. So that plant we're considering a major water spender, and it pretty much is a plant that even with really high temperatures is very tolerant and kept its leaves. When it comes to the Arizona sycamore, it had very similar transpiration rates as the oaks, but when in July, you see that the transpiration rate was almost 0, which we were not surprised because right after the heat wave happened, you started having all these very brown leaves, and we barely had leaves to measure on in July because plants just dropped all their leaves. So this is a major water spender, but with very vulnerable leaves. So it might not be a good option to use that as a plant for urban landscaping, which you can find it here at their ASU campus and in Scottsdale. And here you have the desert willow that at first we kept thinking that it was just a very low plant that just didn't transpire as much. But then you go into June where the plants were very stressed and you see the transpiration increased exponentially as temperatures also increased, but then went down again in July when the temperatures weren't as warm, which leads to a more water conservative strategy. All of this to say that various different plants that occur here in the urban systems in Phoenix do have very different water strategies that need to be considered when these plants are being put into our urban landscape. And here's some conductance. They follow transpiration. I'm not going to go into that. So in summary, exotic tree species transpire within similar range of natives. So we shouldn't be completely dismissing exotics for now, at least. Plants increase stomatoconductance, namely rapid cooling during the heat wave, which was very surprising to us that plants were not as conservative as expected. So the important thing is this is that knowing that these plants can still keep a canopy cover after a heat wave or a very warm summer, but also evaporative cooling around that time is very important. And a lot of our species do not meet that criteria. So for now, what we can say is our current winners are conifers, exotic and natives, desert willow, Arizona ash, and African sumac, which is an exotic. But to actually really finalize this equation, there's still a lot to be done. So right now, what we're doing is to estimate the shade projection of these species, determine their stress level through NDVI, and as well as upscaling these fluxes from the leaf to the canopy level, since these plants have very different types of canopies and different types of leaf area. So with that done, we're also planning this summer to do some work with some real real large established urban trees. So stay tuned. There's a lot to still be done with this project. So in conclusion, further empirical investigations during or for simulated episodic events are necessary. That would lead to a more precise climate biogeographical predictions, accurately quantifying water and carbon stocks, better conservation and urban planning to maximize human comfort and vegetation health, as well as enhance our understanding of physiological processes, because clearly there's a lot that the plants are doing that hasn't been yet documented, and I'm really hoping to bridge that gap in the near future. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention, and here's a picture of our group for the study from last year, and I'm open to questions.
So we have time for a few questions. Are there any in the audience here, first of all? Yes, there's one way over there. My best Phil Donahue jog.
I had a question about the first study that you were talking about. I was curious if, I think some desert plants keep their stomata closed during the day, right?
Yes.
Do you think that they respond to thermal stress similarly, or would that differ?
Yeah, that's a good question. It can vary, because one of the reasons that stomates close, it can be to preserve the pathways that conduct water, which is the xylem, but it can also be because of vulnerability of the leaves. So some of the plants for example, we had mesquite trees that are plants that are really well known, drought tolerant plants here in the desert. Our mesquite trees, for example, only worked during the mornings, and then in the afternoon, the stomates were closed. But they also can shed their leaves if they're affected by thermal damage. So because then they can resprout the leaves. So it can be a mix of just being conservative for the xylem, as well as just being capable of sprouting new leaves later on. So it can be a mix of those two components when it comes to mechanisms to avoid drought or avoid thermal damage.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, we got a couple questions online. Edgar Nero says, thanks for the great talk, first of all, and then asks, any plan to study sisu, which seems to be all over the valley, but maybe needs a lot of water?
I actually don't know that species. Do you know, Heather? Yeah, I do not know, but I'll keep that one in mind. Yeah, I'll keep that one in mind.
Okay, another question is somebody wants clarification or explanation of what you really mean by alternative water use.
If they want a new, can you repeat that?
Yeah, you mentioned alternative water use. Could you explain what that means?
Oh, yeah. Because we would expect that since the plants, if they shut their stomata, they would not photosynthesize or lose water. An alternative water use strategy would be an adaptive strategy that plants can still lose water while also not stimulating carbon, which is somewhat not as commonly found in the literature. So it might sound a little funny because we're talking about that, and I can for sure talk to people on the side and can email me and we can talk more about it. But it is an adaptive strategy to cool down the leaves, especially in places that are affected by heat. It has been seen in other studies with similar traits, but that's the name we gave it. Other papers haven't given it other names, so that's kind of our name. So, but I'm open to discussing this if you want to email me a little further.
Any other questions in the room?
There were other criteria that we used to determine alternative water use, but just because of time, I couldn't present it today.
Sure. Oh, Jackie's got a question.
I was just wondering which plant died.
Oh, it was a shoestring acacia. Actually, it's kind of funny. That one that's right beside my student Isabella, that one was the only one that survived, but all of them died. That one is actually still alive and doing well, but all the other ones died. It's kind of funny because acacias are known to be from very warm places, but it didn't work out for some reason.
All right, we got one more question here. Steve Ruff asks, are you going to try to document water uptake versus cooling to get a sort of efficiency metric for different tree species?
Yeah, we're definitely thinking about that. So we have thermal images of these canopies, and we don't have sensors on the actual stem to get the water uptake directly, but we are thinking about doing some of those work this summer. But yeah, we were thinking about getting some sort of metric that can lead to that. Yes.
Great. So I think we're out of time. So thank you very much again for a very nice talk. And let's thank Luiza again. An applaud in the room. Yay. That was good. That was great. All right. And now let's get the next set of slides up. Oh, look at that. Wow. You can set up the next set of slides. So our next speaker, unfortunately, Professor Borthaker could not be here to introduce, so I'm pinch hitting pretend advisor. So I'm very pleased to introduce Jackie Monkiewicz. Right? I got it right. All right. So Jackie Monkiewicz. Jackie is in the third year of her NSF postdoctoral fellowship here at ASU, working with Professor Borthaker. She got her PhD here at SESE, working with Judge Bowman on low-frequency radio observations with the LWA telescope and the Jansky Very Large Array, both in New Mexico. Jackie has had a non-traditional career path. Prior to arriving in Tempe, she got her master's degree down the road at the U of A, and worked at National Optical Astronomy Observatory and on Spitzer, where she worked on Spitzer Space Telescope legacy data. She's originally from Buffalo, New York. So am I, so that's cool. But reports that she is less adapted to the Arizona heat now than she was 20 years ago. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jackie.
I don't know. I feel like if I have two mics, I'm gonna cause feedback.
Right.
Okay, can you hear me? Can everybody hear me? All right. Right. Yeah, no, and I think the grammar there is, I was like, as I was typing that, I was like, the National Optical Astronomy Observatory is now known as NOIRLAB. So it's the organization previously known as the National. I'm gonna take this off because making my nose do weird things. Okay. So I'm gonna talk about where do extremely metal deficient dwarf galaxies come from. For the rest of this talk, I'm gonna call them XMDs because I don't want to say extremely metal deficient dwarf galaxy. Oh, is there a laser pointer? And sorry, what? Okay, cool. And I am currently an NSF postdoctoral fellow at Arizona State University. My sponsor here at Arizona State is Sanchita Borthaker. Oh, here's it. And just make sure that. And I'm also working with Christian Finlater at New Mexico State University, and Timothy Carlton, who is also a postdoc here at ASU. And if you, like Luiza, you may have heard from me earlier in the autumn when we both presented at the SESE symposium. So some of this may seem familiar. This project that I'm going to present now, a lot of it is actually an outgrowth of what was presented at the SESE symposium, and is in fact the direct result of the SESE symposium, because Tim and I started collaborating as a result of the symposium and some research. So that was just kind of a cool little thing. XMD galaxies, why do you have to go forward? Wait, XMD galaxies, extremely metal deficient dwarf galaxies. So in a second, I'm going to tell you a little bit about metals, because astronomers always do this, and extragalactic astronomers are particularly terrible about it. But are we good? Okay. And in this case, I'm defining them as galaxies which have a nebular oxygen abundance of less than 1/10 solar, and which are currently star forming. And they are, in the modern universe, they are always dwarf galaxies. But they are also commonly used in the modern universe as proto-galaxy analogs. They've recently become very popular targets. They've always kind of been popular targets, but interest has reignited in them because the James Webb Space Telescope is currently, actually right now, observing. There's some press releases coming out very soon of currently observing proto-galaxies imminently. As we speak, the actual thing at the beginning of the universe, the very first galaxies to form. These galaxies are not bad, but they look like protogalaxies in that they are missing most of the metals and heavier elements that normally would be formed, and which we're currently bathing in right here on Earth. The Earth itself, life on Earth, none of it would exist. Planets would not exist without oxygen, silicon, iron, all these good things. And XMD galaxies are mostly missing that, just like protogalaxies are. Originally, when they were first discovered, and this is an example of 1/18 is sort of the canonical one that everyone usually refers to and shows pictures of. And when you look at art of protogalaxies, it often looks exactly like this. So I'm just going to clarify that this is not art. This is actually a Hubble Space Telescope photo image of the galaxy 1/18. This is actually what it looks like. And this image actually was sort of key in that it determined, this was the image that established in 2007 that XMD galaxies are not, in fact, themselves sort of late bloomers. They did not just pop out of the primordial medium, intergalactic medium, like 13 billion years late. There is actually an older population of stars hidden in there. And for some reason, they look very young, but they intrinsically aren't. But before we go on with that, which is sort of the crux of the issue, I just want to apologize to everyone who's not in extragalactic astronomy, and particularly to the geologists and the chemists and basically every other field, in that astronomers do this thing, and extragalactic astronomers in particular, where we refer to the products of stellar nucleosynthesis, all of them, as metals. There are historical reasons for that, because we originally started measuring abundances of the sun, and we were looking at iron, and it kind of made sense. And now we commonly use oxygen, which calling oxygen a metal makes people angry often for some reason. There are fancier versions of this plot where they actually break down all of the periodic elements in table, in terms of what process formed those elements. The point is, at the beginning of the universe, there was only hydrogen. And nowadays we have hydrogen and helium and everything else. And all of that, for the most part, probably came from inside of a star in one form or another. And so when you find more metals in a galaxy, it indicates that more stars have both lived and died. So there have been more generations of stars. And when you find fewer metals in a galaxy, where again, metal could mean iron or it could mean oxygen, they do kind of track each other to some extent. When you find less metals, it means that probably fewer generations of stars have occurred in that galaxy. And in this case, it's not clear that that's the explanation. So the mystery that comes from with the XMDs comes from the fact that we do have these galaxies that are 13.7 billion years old. They look much younger than they are. They look like they're barely a billion years old. And they're not. We know there's older stars in them. So how have they managed to persist to the modern era, looking like really excellent protogalaxy analogs that we could use to do science that would be relevant to the James Webb Space Telescope? They are actually pretty good still as analogs in certain circumstances if you use them correctly. They do have line ratios that are comparable to higher redshift galaxies, and they are suspected, not proven, suspected to be leaking ultraviolet energy into the universe, which is exactly what we expect protogalaxies to do. And if you've attended the talks where we talk about reionization and the sort of work that Judd Bowman does, the UV continuum is what triggers the reionization and turns the intergalactic web back into a plasma soup. How did these galaxies get to be this way? So the two theories that I'd like to present at this time are the two theories that are usually found in the literature, are outflows and inflows. So we're going to start with outflows because they make the most sense. Outflows in this model, and this is another famous example of a XMD galaxy that's in my data set. The outflow model is that these galaxies are typically dwarf galaxies. They're all in the modern universe. Protogalaxies aren't necessarily small. They have to start small because you have to start somewhere, but they don't necessarily remain small. They're very long. And these galaxies are always, in the modern universe, XMDs are always tiny. They're some of the tiniest dwarf galaxies that we know. They're barely pushing the limit of how small a galaxy can be. And so maybe they just don't have enough mass. Maybe they don't have enough gravity to hang on to the products of stellar nucleosynthesis. Maybe when stars die, to the process by which stars put those metals into the intergalactic or into interstellar medium of the galaxy, it really only takes 2 or 3 supernovae going off in one of these little tiny galaxies to sort of burp all of the gas out of the poor little galaxy. And so maybe they just can't hold on to it. And that, for 10 or 20 years, honestly, that's what just people assumed. There was no proof. To be honest, there kind of really still isn't that this is what's happening, but people just assumed it had to be happening because they are so small. Lately, in the last 5 or 10 years, people have been more leaning towards the idea of inflows, which sounds like you really can't have both. Inflows, where you have unenriched, instead of galaxies burping out their metal enriched gas, we have galaxies tapping into an previously unknown reservoir of unenriched pristine gas. And the evidence for this comes from the fact that most of the galaxies, including quite a lot of the ones in my sample for my thesis, they have these sort of cometary structures where all the star formation is taking place on one side of it, and that part of the galaxy is very metal poor. That's the part we initially were measuring and saying, wow, there's no oxygen, there's no iron in here. But when we observed them more carefully with Hubble, et cetera, we noticed that there were these older disks of galaxies that were fainter and harder to notice, but when we measured the metallicities, they were higher. There are these metallicity gradients, which suggests, maybe the new star formation there's something happening here. These galaxies are pulling in unenriched gas. And so the existence of XMDs is because they're tapping into pure gas. It's just hydrogen and helium. Some quick definitions. I've been using XMD. Those are extreme metallicity. They're defined as having nebular oxygen abundance of less than 1/10 solar. In the rest of the talk, I will sometimes refer to LMDs, and those are an intermediate case. Those are low metallicity galaxies, but they're not quote unquote extreme. And if you know your galaxies, these are galaxies like the Small Magellanic Cloud. Small Magellanic Cloud is actually a metal-rich example of an LMD, the upper end. These are galaxies with a metallicity of 1/10 to 1/5 solar, and actually this should be more like less than 0.8.0. And normal metallicity is everything else. These are dwarf galaxies that have galaxies comparable to that of the metallicities comparable to that of the sun. And the Large Magellanic Cloud is a fine example of that kind of dwarf galaxy. And when I went through and did my thesis, what I discovered is that XMDs aren't so rare, that there's actually really a large number of them now. And I also discovered that a really large number of them were irritatingly close together in the sky, which made doing my observations really difficult because I was waiting for one part of the night to happen when all the galaxies came up, and I was rushing to observe them all, and then I ran out of galaxies as the sky kept moving, and then there was nothing to do for the rest of the night. So I discovered that all of my galaxies were at a right ascension of about 10 or 11. And when I plotted it up on the sky, this is some of what I was presenting during this internal symposium, the SESE symposium. When I plotted them up on the sky, is I discovered that they're all kind of in this line, which is sort of an interesting thing to discover. And I took this to mean as evidence that there was a sort of a filament of these low metallicity galaxies hanging out together in space, clustered in some way, where they're not actually following the majority of, they're not necessarily following the clustering of all of the galaxies in the local universe, but they're not unaware of it either. So they're not inside the main filament. Go back for a second. They're not inside the main filament where most of the mass in the local universe is, but they're following it. They're next to it. And I took this as a sign that there was some kind of physical structure there, invisible physical structure that these galaxies were tracing in some way. And you can see in this plot, this is actually the red and pink dots, if you can see those. Those are actually known filaments that were previously detected by Kim et al. In their papers 2016 and 2019. I think actually the 2016 paper is better. I then went on and actually when you see something in 2 dimensions on the sky, that doesn't necessarily, it can be a projection effect. So I actually went and broke this up into 3D space. And so in 3D space, you actually see it's still there. You still see this structure, this filamentary structure, which is, and the red dots are again the chimidol filaments. The chimidol filaments have no special metallicity properties. Only the blue filament is the one that has unique properties. So my inference, the conclusion that I'm making in this paper that I'm writing, is that they are tapped into a pristine reservoir that's invisible, that's causing the current episode of star formation, which is metal poor. And that's actually, these are not inherently pristine galaxies, it's that they are pulling from a pristine source. And so I'm taking this as indirect evidence of the inflow hypothesis, not the outflow hypothesis. So then Tim Carlton came up to me and said, well, what do the simulations say? And I said, my assumption naively was that these simulations said nothing about XMDs because they are so tiny. These are galaxies that are like 100th or 1,000th the size of the Milky Way. And I believe that they were just below the limit. I had been previously told that they were below the detection limits, the modeling limits for simulations such as illustrious TNG. And Tim said, well, why don't we just look? So we looked. And it turns out that there are XMDs in illustrious. So illustrious, for those of you who aren't familiar with cosmological simulations, they're a little bit different from the kinds of simulations. If you attended Ed Bui's thesis talk yesterday, Ed was showing simulations of hydrodynamical simulations of galaxies that were very detailed. These are cosmological, so they're over larger space. They don't have quite the same level of detail, but they have all of cosmology built into them. And it's common to sort of use the sort of simulations Ed has at sort of like zoom in on smaller aspects. Illustrious TNG itself comes in sort of 3 flavors with that sort of zoom in idea in mind, and that there's like a large volume of 300 megaparsecs on a side, 300 million parsecs is a megaparsec. So it's a very huge amount of space. A smallest one is 50 megaparsecs on the side, which is that you can sort of see that here's TNG 50, TNG 300, TNG 100. You can sort of see that the bigger the volume is, the less resolution you have. The bigger the volume is, the larger the minimum mass that you can resolve is. And we decided that 100 is sort of the sweet space. We would like to look at 300 because over the large volume, these are rare galaxies. We'd like to see them where they are scattered in the universe, but we also would like to see them at all. So we needed the resolution to be able to even detect them in the simulation. There we go. So we're using 100. And there are, in fact, XMDs in illustrious 100. And some of the encouraging things about it is that they actually, even though they are really close to the resolution of what you can do with illustrious TNG 100, they have comparable stellar masses to what you actually find for XMDs in reality, which is encouraging. They have comparable physical and chemical conditions at a redshift of 0. That includes the gas phase metallicity, which is the selection effect. So we're kind of artificially introducing that. The gas fraction, the gas temperature, the star formation rate, all these things, they kind of look like real XMDs. So the next question is, do we see the same sort of clustering behavior? And yeah, actually, we kind of do. So on the left side of this simulation, we see XMDs that are sort of hanging out near the filaments, not necessarily in them. We also see a bunch of them in voids, which I did not previously have in my sample. But there are papers that have come out. Postilnik et al. Have discovered several XMDs. They've discovered them by just searching the voids, looking for them. So void XMDs also exist. We don't necessarily know the difference between XMDs that are here versus XMDs that are there. But there are these 2 populations, and they're reflected in the illustrious volume. we find in Illustris, generally speaking, that they are more isolated than their normal dwarfs. So we selected normal dwarfs that were mass matched for each XMP and for each LMP. We randomly selected 3 normal dwarf galaxies that had comparable mass, and we did a nearest neighbor analysis. And what we discovered from the nearest neighbor analysis, so D3 and D5. So this is the 3rd nearest neighbor, how far away it is in thousands of kiloparsecs. 5th nearest neighbor, and that how far away it is in thousands of kiloparsecs. And it's a little hard to see, but the normal galaxies are this sort of mass matched to the XMPs and the LMPs. They tend to be much closer to their nearest neighbors than either the XMPs or the LMPs. So they're not necessarily, it's really difficult to prove that they're clustering with one another, but they are generally farther away from things. The one thing that is very different in Illustris from real life is that they are about 100 times more, there's 100 times greater density of XMPs in Illustris. And this could just be a failure. It's really hard to say at this point. This could be a failure of astronomers in the real universe to find these things, because we're sort of scraping the bottom of the barrel looking for them. And when I was assembling my thesis sample, it's like people ask me, how did you assemble this sample? What are your limits? What are your constraints? Can you describe the sample? And I'm like, this is an extremely inhomogeneous sample selection. This is just everything that's volume complete in the nearest 2 megaparsecs, and then things go completely the heck outside of that. And it's really, I can't really say that that's significant yet, but as of right now, we are finding many more XMDs in the simulated data than in the real universe per cubic megaparsec. We also are discovering in the simulated data that neither the inflow nor the outflow hypothesis really makes sense. So one of the things you can do with simulated data that you can't do with real galaxies is you can take that galaxy, put a pin in it, and then dial it back in time to look at what it was doing 1 billion years ago, 5 billion years ago, 10 billion years ago. And so Tim went and extracted the metallicities over cosmic time in the simulations. And what we discover is XMDs are not low metallicity galaxies for their entire lifetime. This is, in fact, when we say this is an XMD, we are describing the current state of a galaxy effective as of maybe 2 billion years ago. 5 billion years ago, it probably was a normal metallicity dwarf galaxy. In fact, and this seems to be somewhat resilience to, we've done the selection a couple of different ways. In fact, they may actually be more metal rich than the modern higher metallicity galaxies. At earlier times, they seem to have higher metallicities, and at late times, somehow they've lost their metallicities. It's confusing, and what's more confusing is we see a drop in the star formation rates that goes with this. Normally, we would have anticipated the opposite, that if it were the inflow model, that these galaxies are intaking pristine gas, and that's what's making them metal poor, fine. But you would expect to see their star formation jumping as they get injection of new fuel to form new stars. And instead, we see their metallicities dropping, their metallicity and their star formation dropping at the same time. And there's maybe a little bump in star formation right before we catch them and sample, tag them as XMDs. And this result is robust, even if we change we started choosing different redshift chunks of the simulate. We took different snapshots of Illustris at different times and selected XMDs, which are a completely different sample. If you grab the XMDs at a redshift of 0.5, so that's actually kind of in cosmic time, that's almost halfway back to the beginning of the universe. The XMDs we select at that time are different than the XMDs we select now. And you see the same thing, where the metallicity is dropping and the star formation is also down. So some conclusions. XMDs are not necessarily found in overdensity voids. They are generally found along the edges of large-scale structures. They're not necessarily found along all edges. If I have a large-scale structure, a cluster, or a filament, I'm not necessarily going to find XMDs hanging out along the edges of it. But if I do find XMDs hanging out in a group, they're probably doing it alongside the edge of some larger. They're aware of larger scale structure, and they seem to be parallel to previously known filaments. There are some in voids. It does suggest that there's a common reservoir of extremely metal poor gas. And in the real universe, in the local volume, specifically, there's a reservoir of extremely metal poor gas, potentially on the near side, the west side of the Virgo supercluster. And this is consistent in 3 dimensions. It's not just a projection effect on the sky. And when we look at simulations, we find XMDs. We find many more about XMDs than we think we should find based on how rare they are in the local universe. And they aren't, when we look at them over cosmic time, they aren't always XMDs. We see a drop in star formation, and when the metal and that corresponds to a drop in metallicity, which is sort of the opposite of what we expect. And at the end of the day, I really I was pretty prepared to say that the inflow model is correct, the outflow model is not. The simulations kind of muddle the picture, so I'm not really sure what's going on anymore, but it's interesting. And I think that the next thing that we would probably need to do is actually go into Illustris and pull out the particle data, which is a horrible thing to have to do. Pull out all the particle data. Tim has started doing this, and he's got like one galaxy that's like destroying his computer with data, with particle data, and just like to see, are the particles being ejected or coming in, and like what are the metallicity of the individual particles that are coming into and out of the galaxy's gravitational well. And I think that's the only way we're going to find the answer. And that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have time for a couple of questions. There's a question from the audience here first.
Hi, Jackie.
Hey.
So I was wondering, do you have any plans to use other simulations other than Illustris? Because do you think you'd find XMDs in those simulations as well? Or yeah, can you talk a little bit about that?
I mean, that's a great question. But I think we've kind of got our hands full actually at the moment. So I think someone should. But as of right now, we're just trying to figure out what we've got here.
Other questions? Nope.
Thanks, really interesting. Excuse me. So you said that in the real universe, the XMDs are kind of aligned along a line that's parallel to, but not exactly in the filaments.
Yeah, let me.
And so I'm wondering in Illustris, yeah, you had a nice figure of this, right?
Okay, so do you want to see Illustris or do you want to see the real world?
Yeah, so my question is, okay, well, let's do one and then the next.
Okay, so this is Illustris, and it's really horrible because, and now I'm starting to do it. I'm an observer, and I've always objected to people who do simulation of galaxies referring to their data as data, because that's not what data means to me, but now I'm starting to do it. So here's the simulated data.
So here it's not, is it parallel to but next to, or is it actually, are these filaments or these XMDs following the, say the dark, where the dark matter
I'm
is?
going to assert that these are parallel, but next to, when they're like little circle that didn't draw the eye, maybe, or that they're never quite in the actual filament. They're always sort of next to. On this side of the simulation. On that side of the simulation, we have these void X.
Okay.
Does that? And then in the real world,
yeah, interesting.
In the real world, what we see is, we see, sometimes it's hard to sort of see where the clustering of the supercluster is, but so in the real world we have, here's the Virgo supercluster and the associated filaments. This is actually, most of this is a projection effect. It's actually kind of coming towards us. And I should actually explain when I switch to 3D. This is a projection on the sky. This is a 2D projection on the sky. When we switch to 3D, if you're not familiar with supergalactic coordinates, the Y coordinate is moving towards or away from the Virgo. So Virgo, it's centered on Virgo, and this coordinate's moving away towards Virgo and away from us, and we are actually located here at 0, 0. So I've actually centered Virgo here, and then the supergalactic plane, which is this structure that you can see in the other picture. The supergalactic plane, Z is the coordinate that goes in and out of it, sort of like latitude, little orientation. But yeah, my assertion is still that, yeah, I feel like it's clearer here that they're next to, but we can argue about the definition of next to in the lustrous.
Okay, interesting. Thanks.
Well, one of the things that I've personally been struggling with is figuring out a way of mathematically describing that. You know, like I know how to describe environment in terms of density, but and you know, nearest neighbors, and like describing, it's kind of clustering, but not. It's really struggling to find a mathematical way of describing. Yeah.
Great. We have a couple other questions, but I think in the interest of time, we should wrap it up. So thank you both, Jackie and Luiza. You did like a great job of presenting talks that were sophisticated, but also really easy to grasp what the basic issues were. So thanks very much for doing that. It takes a lot of work. So if only all our visiting speakers would do the same thing. So thanks, and thanks everybody for coming in person, and we'll see you next week.